So let's talk about the Alec Baldwin shooting incident on that movie set in New Mexico. The Santa Fe County District Attorney just announced that she will not take off the table the possibility of criminal charges. So let's discuss the legal principles that will now come into play in trying to determine if anybody has criminal liability for that shooting that left one dead and another wounded. Because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So let's talk about the Alec Baldwin shooting incident, because the Santa Fe County District Attorney just said that she is not taking off the table the possibility of criminal charges. And here's how the New York Times is reporting the story today. Headline: Criminal charges possible in shooting on Alec Baldwin set, DA says. And the article begins: the Santa Fe County District Attorney said on Tuesday that she was not ruling out criminal charges in last week's fatal shooting on a film set. The actor, Alec Baldwin, was rehearsing with a gun that he had been told did not contain live ammunition when it went off, killing the film's cinematographer and wounding its director. So let's take just a few minutes and go to Team Justice Law School and talk about some of the concepts and the principles that will now come into play, being as this is a criminal investigation into the shooting on that movie set. And I want to talk briefly about the term homicide, about something that the law calls duty of care, and then I want to talk about the involuntary manslaughter statute in New Mexico that will apply in the context of this investigation. First of all, the word homicide, strictly defined, is death at the hands of another. It does not necessarily connote criminal conduct. So, for example, if somebody pulls a gun on me and I defend myself by pushing that person out of the way, that person falls, strikes his head on a curb and dies, that would likely be ruled by a forensic pathologist, a doctor who performs autopsies. It would be ruled a homicide. Why? Because it was death at the hands of another. It was a perfectly lawful homicide. It was justified under the circumstances. So it's not criminal. Homicide doesn't equal criminal. It just means death at the hands of another. So there was a homicide committed on this movie set when Alec Baldwin fired or discharged that gun, and a person was killed and another person was wounded. The next concept I want to talk about is duty of care. The law says we all have a duty of care to one another. We don't seem to talk about the duty of care that we have to one another these days, certainly not the moral duty of care, but there's a legal duty of care. So let's talk about the duty of care in the workplace, because this movie set was a workplace. So, you know, the duty of care that we owe one another is not to engage in negligent or reckless conduct and injure a coworker, for example. So if you think of the duty of care kind of on a spectrum, right? You have purely accidental conduct. If you do something and accidentally injure another, well, the law says that person probably can't sue you because you didn't really violate your duty of care. It was, strictly speaking, an accident. And obviously you can't be charged with a crime if what you do is purely accidental. Now, the far end of the spectrum is intentional conduct, right? Somebody who intends to hurt another and injures another has committed a crime. But there's this wide gray area in the middle. After accident, you have negligent conduct, grossly negligent conduct, reckless conduct. Some jurisdictions have criminal recklessness, and then intentional conduct on the far end of the spectrum. And what it feels like we're dealing with on the scene of this movie is in that gray area, somewhere between negligence, gross negligence, recklessness. I don't think there's any suggestion that Alec Baldwin or the person who handed him the gun intended that somebody should be shot, somebody should be killed. So we're in that gray area when it comes to the duty of care. So then I think it's important to turn to the New Mexico law, specifically the law on involuntary manslaughter. That's a relatively low level of homicide, right? Because you have murder in the first degree, murder in the second degree, voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter. Some jurisdictions have negligent homicide, which can even be lower than involuntary manslaughter. But I want to look specifically to the involuntary manslaughter statute in New Mexico to see how it might apply to what we are learning happened on that movie set. And here's how it reads. Involuntary manslaughter consists of manslaughter committed in the commission of an unlawful act not amounting to a felony. That's part one. And I want to pause there because if you kill somebody during the commission of a felony, even if you didn't intend to kill them, that's what we call felony murder. If you kill somebody in the commission of a misdemeanor, a relatively low-level offense, and you didn't intend to kill them, that can be misdemeanor manslaughter. And that's what part one of this involuntary manslaughter statute under the New Mexico law is getting at. But we're going to go to part two because I think that's the part that arguably applies to the Alec Baldwin incident. So if in the commission of a lawful act that might produce death in an unlawful manner without due caution and circumspection, you end up killing somebody, it could be involuntary manslaughter. So if you're doing a lawful act and it produces death and you did that lawful act without due caution or circumspection, kind of a grossly negligent or a reckless act, then you could be on the hook for involuntary manslaughter. And that, I think, is where the criminal law rubber will meet the road. It's that involuntary manslaughter statute. I suspect that's what the Santa Fe District Attorney will be investigating. Whether this was such a reckless act that was likely to injure another and it ended up producing death. So it gets complicated, though, when you have multiple actors, right? Because you have the person responsible for the gun. I'll call him the prop guy, but let's be clear. This was not a prop gun. This was a real gun being used as a prop. I don't know Hollywood filmmaking. I don't know why they would use a real gun on the set of a movie when they should use a prop gun, an inoperable gun, one that is not capable of firing a projectile. So this was a real gun being used as a prop. And apparently the prop guy said it's a cold gun, it's safe, it's inoperable, it can't hurt anybody, and he handed it to Alec Baldwin. At least that is what we see in the reporting. And then Alec Baldwin apparently pointed it, pulled the trigger, and it fired with tragic consequences. So when you're talking about criminal liability, when you have multiple actors in the chain that resulted in death or injury, it becomes very complicated. Who might be criminally responsible for the ultimate death or for the non-fatal injuries to the second person? These are matters that can only be determined by a full, fair, thorough, impartial investigation of what happened on that movie set. And let's hope that the Santa Fe District Attorney does just that and reaches the appropriate conclusion about whether anybody is criminally responsible for what happened. Friends, as always, please stay safe. Please stay tuned. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.